Okay, so ready to dive into the world of WikiLeaks.
Buckle up. We're about to unpack classified documents, government secrets, a whole digital whirlwind, really.
Yeah, this is not your average, hey, come check out our website type of organization.
Not at all. It's a fascinating case study in the digital age, really. Where do you even begin with an organization like WikiLeaks?
Well, our deep dive today comes from, we're looking at this Wikipedia article about WikiLeaks,
Right.
and it's a good starting point. I mean, we're going to get into the organization, like its origins and stuff, the big things that it did, all the controversy.
That's a thing, right? It's important to remember that this is just one perspective on, a very complex, multifaceted story.
Totally. So one thing the article mentions is that WikiLeaks was founded back in 2006 by, the infamous Julian Assange, but things really blew up in 2010, right?
Absolutely. I mean, 2010 was a turning point for WikiLeaks and really for global politics when you think about it. It was the year they released that collateral murder video. I mean, it showed that U.S. airstrike that tragically killed civilians and two journalists. This wasn't just any leak, though. This was footage that really shook the world. I mean, it forced this huge conversation about the true cost of war. Do you remember when that happened, what you were thinking?
Oh, yeah. Vividly, I mean, I remember thinking I was, like, seeing something I wasn't supposed to be seeing,
Yeah.
It was raw, it felt real, and incredibly disturbing, of course, and it sparked so much debate around the world.
And that was just the beginning. Shortly after that came the Afghan war logs and then the Iraq war logs. Each one just kind of kept exposing more and more potential war crimes, hidden truths about those conflicts. I think what's so interesting is how WikiLeaks challenged everyone's understanding, like the accepted narratives around these wars.
It was like the whole world got a glimpse behind the curtain, got to see how the machine works, the war machine, you know what I mean? It was definitely changed a lot of people's minds about things.
It did. And WikiLeaks' whole thing was that transparency, no matter how uncomfortable, was crucial, even if it meant revealing, these hard truths about really powerful institutions.
Speaking of uncomfortable truth, the article also mentions Cablegate. Can you remind us what that was all about?
Okay, so imagine this. It's late 2010. WikiLeaks drops another bombshell, right? Hundreds of thousands of U.S. diplomatic cables, all leaked for the world to see. And these documents, they were a gold mine. I mean, they revealed everything. Behind-the-scenes assessments of world leaders, these candid and sometimes, kind of embarrassing discussions of U.S. foreign policy. It had it all.
Must have been a field day for journalists, political analysts, everybody, right? Was there anything in those cables that really surprised you?
It's hard to pick just one, but I remember one cable revealed China's long-term interest in, like, a unified Korea, and that had major geopolitical implications, even back then. And these leaks, I mean, this wasn't just gossip. This had real-world consequences.
And it sounds like WikiLeaks really had a knack for exposing what was going on beneath the surface of global politics. But all this attention, it didn't come without a price, though, right?
Right.
The article talks about censorship, cyber attacks, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, you're right. WikiLeaks quickly became a target, and I mean a big one. They were hit with these DDoS attacks, and they were so bad that they had to move all their information over to Amazon's cloud computing servers just to stay online. Imagine being under that kind of digital siege, constantly under attack like that.
So they were getting hit with digital attacks. But what about, like, in the real world? Were there attempts to silence them offline, too?
Oh, absolutely. China, for example, blocked access to the WikiLeaks site pretty early on. It was a pretty clear move to control the narrative, I'd say, and try to, limit the spread of potentially damaging information, especially to their own citizens, right?
Wow. Wow, it sounds like a real-life information war playing out.
You could say that. And it wasn't just governments either. Because of pressure from U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman, Amazon, they actually dropped WikiLeaks from their servers. So, WikiLeaks had to find somewhere else to put all that data.
It's crazy how they went from being hosted by this tech giant to being, like, digitally blacklisted almost overnight.
Totally. It just shows you the power that these tech companies have. And it didn't stop there. They even lost their domain name for a while after their DNS provider, Every DNS. They terminated their contract. That made it way harder for people to even find the website.
Wow, so they were getting squeezed from all sides. So how did they even keep operating? Were they constantly having to jump between servers and everything?
It was a constant battle for sure, but they always seemed to find a way. Like when PayPal, the payment platform, closed their account, which cut off a major source of funding.
Yeah, that must have been a huge blow to them. How they adapt to that?
They had to get creative. There was this Icelandic company, DataCell, and they stepped in to process payments for WikiLeaks. essentially challenging those blockades that bigger corporations like Visa and MasterCard had put in place, because they were blocking donations and payments to the organization, too.
So even with all that pressure from these huge corporations, they still found a way to stay afloat. There's an irony in there somewhere, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's a real David and Goliath thing going on in this story, and the whole world was watching. But while they faced a ton of opposition, they also got a lot of support, too.
Right. The article mentioned support from some big names, like Daniel Ellsberg, the guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers, right?
Exactly.
He saw some clear parallels between what he did and what WikiLeaks was doing, right?
Totally. Ellsberg became a big advocate for WikiLeaks. I mean, he was drawing these direct comparisons to his own actions during Vietnam. He saw that same mission, that drive for transparency to fight against government secrecy. It was like a continuation of what he'd been fighting for, but decades earlier.
Wow. That's a powerful comparison.
Hmm.
Were there any other big names that came out in support of WikiLeaks?
Oh, yeah, tons. John Pilger, the journalist and filmmaker, he wrote this whole, really powerful defense of WikiLeaks, called it a new form of journalism that challenged traditional power.
Interesting. So they had support from established journalists, activists, people like that. It really shows the kind of impact they had, at least among certain groups.
For sure. And their reach, it went way beyond just the U.S. and Europe, too. Like even Lula da Silva, the former Brazilian president, he spoke out for them, too. Argued that trying to silence WikiLeaks was basically an attack on free speech.
So their message was resonating, even in countries with, let's just say, their own complicated relationship with government transparency.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like they really did tap into this global desire for accountability from people in power. It's kind of ironic, though, right? Even Donald Trump, when he was campaigning back in 2016, even he praised WikiLeaks a few times.
Which is kind of wild when you think about how he felt about leaks and whistleblowers later on. But let's talk about the other side of things for a second. The criticisms. The article mentions a lot of concerns about privacy, accusations of political bias. That's serious stuff.
It is, and you can't really understand WikiLeaks unless you understand both sides. The privacy stuff was mainly about them releasing these unredacted documents, stuff that supposedly had really sensitive personal information on it, like social security numbers and even details about suicide attempts.
So it wasn't always about what was leaked, but also how they did it.
Yeah, exactly.
That brings up a whole other conversation about responsibility and how much transparency is too much.
Right. And then, of course, you had those allegations of political bias, especially during that 2016 election.
Which is interesting because, like you said, even Trump supported them at one point.
I know. But the timing of some of their releases, especially the ones about Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, made a lot of people think that WikiLeaks was trying to influence the election.
And WikiLeaks has denied that, right?
Yeah. They've always said that they're not on any one side. They just want to expose wrongdoing, whoever it is.
But even some people who believed in transparency, they still had problems with WikiLeaks, didn't they? Like people who basically agreed with their overall mission, but didn't like the way they were doing it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some people questioned their methods, like what their motives really were, if they were really doing enough to protect their sources. John Young, he was a WikiLeaks board member, and he also ran a similar site called Cryptome. But even he publicly questioned them.
What was he concerned about? Did he think they weren't really committed to transparency?
Well, at one point, he actually accused them of being a front for the CIA, which is.
Wow, a CIA front. That's quite the accusation, especially coming from someone who's supposed to be on the same side, basically.
It just shows you how much mistrust there was, even among people who were supposedly fighting for the same thing.
It's like the story of WikiLeaks is as much about the people involved and the arguments they had as it is about the actual information they were putting out there. It's pretty wild that people who dedicated themselves to exposing secrets could be so suspicious of each other.
Totally. It really highlights how messy and complicated information is, especially in the digital age. It's a reminder that transparency, privacy, manipulation, those lines can get really blurry really fast, and who you choose to trust or what you choose to trust makes all the difference.
It's amazing how one organization, WikiLeaks, has become this central point in all these huge questions about power and information and who we even trust anymore.
It is, and it makes you wonder, right? What is the price of transparency? How far is too far? If it means potentially putting someone in danger, and who gets to decide where that line is anyway?
Yeah, these aren't easy questions to answer, especially now. But let's get back to WikiLeaks. Where do they stand today? The article says they're still out there, still active, but things have been pretty quiet lately.
They have. I mean, they still publish stuff, but their last big document dump, like a major release, was back in 2019. Even some of their older stuff is harder to get to these days.
Why is that? Did the internet just move on, or is something else going on?
Probably a bit of both. I mean, think about it. All those legal battles, cyber attacks, financial pressure, it takes a toll, like trying to operate under constant threat, it wears you down.
And then there's Julian Assange. The article says he's still fighting to avoid extradition to the U.S.
He is. Assange is, well, he's inseparable from the whole WikiLeaks story at this point. He's facing some serious charges in the U.S. Related to those 2010 leaks, specifically the classified military documents.
Espionage charges. Right? That seems to be the big one.
Yeah, basically the U.S. government's case is that Assange broke the law, that by getting and publishing classified information, he violated the Espionage Act, put national security at risk.
But his supporters say he was acting as a journalist.
Yeah.
That he was just shining a light on, wrongdoing.
Exactly. And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is WikiLeaks journalism?
Yeah.
Activism? Something else entirely? Do they deserve the same protections as, traditional reporters? Or do their methods put them in a whole different category? It's a huge question for the future of journalism, how we think about freedom of the press, the whole thing.
Yeah, and a question that probably won't be answered anytime soon, especially with technology constantly changing. Those lines between journalism, activism, and even espionage are getting blurrier all the time.
That's right. I mean, look, information moves so fast these days, it feels like the old categories, the old playbooks, just don't really apply anymore, do they? Which is something WikiLeaks both benefited from and, in a way, helped create.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. It seems pretty clear that the story of WikiLeaks, it's not over yet. So if this deep dive piqued your curiosity, and I'm sure it did, check out the show notes for some additional resources on this.
There are so many angles to explore with this one. And remember, with any complex issue like we've been talking about today, the more perspectives you can get, the better you'll understand it all.
So until next time, keep asking those tough questions, seek out different viewpoints, and keep exploring this wild world of information. See you next time.